Hitler's top scientists laughed when they first heard about radio detection. They shouldn't have. In the summer of 1940, as Luftwaffe bombers blackened the skies over Britain, German intelligence officers studied reconnaissance photographs with growing confusion. British fighter planes were somehow appearing at exactly the right altitude, at exactly the right time to intercept their raids. It was as if the British could see through clouds, through darkness, through the very fog of war itself. They could. But by the time Germany's scientific elite realized what Britain had built along its coastal cliffs, it was already too late. The technology they had dismissed as radio parlor tricks was about to change the nature of warfare forever. This is the story of how technological arrogance nearly won Hitler the war, and how a handful of British scientists, working in secret against impossible odds, used invisible beams of radio energy to save their nation from invasion. Berlin, 1935. The German Reich stood at the pinnacle of scientific achievement. German physicists had split the atom. German engineers had pioneered television broadcasting. German chemists had synthesized revolutionary materials. When the world thought of cutting-edge science, it thought of German laboratories, German universities, then German minds. And they knew it. Dr. Rudolf Kunold, director of the German Navy's Signals Research Division, sat in his laboratory at Kiel University, reviewing reports from the Kriegsmarine. The problem was straightforward. How do you detect enemy ships and aircraft before they can see you? Kunold had been experimenting with something called radio direction finding, the idea that you could bounce radio waves off distant objects and measure their return. In 1934, his team had successfully detected a ship at a range of 12 miles using this method. It was crude, experimental, but it worked. He wrote a detailed report and sent it up the chain of command. The response was underwhelming. Hermann Göring, commander of the newly formed Luftwaffe, dismissed the technology outright. The Reichsmarshal was an ace fighter pilot from the Great War, a man who believed in the superiority of the human eye, the instinct of the warrior, the skill of the pilot. Radio detection seemed like a crutch for the weak, a distraction from real combat training. Our fighters don't need to hide behind radio equipment, he reportedly told his staff. They need courage, speed, and superior tactics. But it wasn't just military arrogance. Germany's scientific establishment had its own reasons for skepticism. Dr. Hans Plendl, a leading radio physicist, calculated that the radio wavelengths necessary for accurate detection would require impossibly large antennas. The power requirements would be astronomical. The interference from weather, terrain, and the ionosphere would render any readings unreliable. From a purely theoretical standpoint, large-scale radio detection seemed impractical at best. Germany's scientists weren't stupid. They were rational, methodical, and their calculations were correct, based on the assumptions they were making. And those assumptions would doom them. Across the channel, a different calculation. While Germany's scientific elite debated theory, Britain faced an existential crisis. January 1935. The Air Ministry convened a secret meeting. The question on the table was terrifying in its simplicity. How do you defend an island nation against bomber aircraft? The previous war had shown everyone what bombers could do. London had been hit by German Zeppelins and Gotha bombers. The casualties were relatively light, but the psychological impact was profound. And now in 1935, bomber technology had advanced exponentially. The Stanley Baldwin government had publicly stated the grim reality. The bomber will always get through. It was into this atmosphere of quiet desperation that Robert Watson Watt walked. Watson Watt was a Scottish meteorologist and radiophysicist working at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington. He was 43 years old, tall, with piercing eyes, and a reputation for unconventional thinking. He had been experimenting with radio waves for tracking thunderstorms, using radio signals to detect the ionization from lightning. On January 12, 1935, Harry Wimperis, Director of Scientific Research at the Air Ministry, sent Watson Watt a peculiar inquiry. The ministry had been investigating the possibility of a death ray, a beam of radio energy powerful enough to destroy aircraft or kill pilots in mid-flight. Watson Watt did the calculations. He wrote back, "A death ray was impossible with current technology. The power requirements were absurd." But then he added something else. In a handwritten note at the bottom of his report, he suggested an alternative. Attention is being turned to the still difficult but less unpromising problem of radio detection. 3 weeks later, on February 26, 1935, Watson Watt conducted a demonstration. The Daventry experiment. The location was a field near Daventry in the English Midlands. Watson Watt had arranged to use the BBC's shortwave radio transmitter, a powerful broadcaster that sent signals across the empire. The theory was simple. When an aircraft flew through the radio waves being broadcast by the BBC transmitter, it would scatter and reflect some of that energy. If you had a sensitive receiver positioned properly, you could detect those reflections. The equipment was primitive. A radio receiver mounted in the back of a van, an oscilloscope to display the signals, and Arnold "Skip" Wilkins, Watson Watt's brilliant young assistant, frantically making calculations on a notepad. At 11:30 a.m., a RAF Hayford bomber flew into position, following a predetermined flight path through the radio beam. Wilkins watched the oscilloscope screen. For a moment, nothing, just static, random noise, and then a spike. A clear, unmistakable deflection on the screen. The aircraft was 8 miles away. Wilkins looked up at Watson Watt. Watson Watt looked at the Air Ministry officials who had traveled to witness the test. They had just seen the future of warfare. Within weeks, the British government had authorized funding for what would become the most secret weapons program of the pre-war period. They called it Radio Direction Finding, or RDF. The term radar, an American acronym for Radio Detection and Ranging, wouldn't be adopted until 1940. But the British had something far more valuable than a name. They had a head start: the German parallel universe. Here's the remarkable thing. Germany was working on radar too. In fact, by 1936, the German Navy had successfully deployed a radar system called Seetakt on the pocket battleship Graf Spee. It could detect ships at a range of 15 miles. German scientists, led by Rudolf Kunold and his team, had independently developed many of the same principles the British were using. The Luftwaffe also had radar under development. Dr. Wilhelm Runge's team at Telefunken was building air defense radar systems. The Freya radar, operational by 1938, was in many ways more advanced than Britain's early systems. It was mobile, it used shorter wavelengths, and it was more accurate. So why did Germany lose the radar race? The answer isn't that German science failed. It's that German strategy failed. Hermann Göring, architect of the Luftwaffe, fundamentally misunderstood what radar was for. He saw it as a defensive tool, something you might use to protect ships or key installations. But defense was for the weak. The Luftwaffe was built around the Blitzkrieg doctrine, overwhelming offensive power delivered with speed and surprise. Why invest in seeing the enemy when the doctrine was to strike first, strike hard, and strike everywhere at once? This wasn't irrational. Germany's military planners assumed, correctly at first, that their forces would be the aggressors. Poland, France, the Low Countries. Germany would be attacking, not defending. Radar seemed like something you built when you were scared, when you were waiting for someone to hit you. Britain, meanwhile, was building exactly that kind of system, and they were building it on a scale that would have seemed insane to any rational military planner. Chain Home. The Invisible Wall Spring, 1936. The Suffolk coast of England. A strange structure was rising from the cliffs near Bawdsey Manor, an imposing Victorian estate overlooking the North Sea. Steel towers 350 feet tall, connected by webs of cable. To anyone watching from the shore, they looked like radio transmitting stations, which technically they were. But they were listening more than they were broadcasting. This was the first station of what would become Chain Home, Britain's coastal radar network. And it was unlike anything ever attempted in military technology. Robert Watson Watt had been given a nearly impossible mandate: create a system that could detect aircraft approaching Britain from any direction at any altitude in any weather, day or night, and do it with 1930s technology. His solution was brute force. Chain Home stations would use massive fixed antennas broadcasting on long wavelengths, 10 to 13 meters. These wavelengths were inefficient for precision, but they had one critical advantage: range. A Chain Home station could detect bombers up to 120 miles away at altitudes up to 15,000 feet. The system was slow. The displays were primitive, just blips on oscilloscope screens, manually tracked by operators using grease pencils on plotting boards. The accuracy was terrible by modern standards. Position errors of several miles were common. But it worked. And more importantly, it was integrated. This was Watson Watt's genius. He understood that radar was only half the system. You also needed communications, command centers, fighter direction rooms, and a doctrine for using all of it together. By 1938, Britain had begun constructing Chain Home stations all along its eastern and southern coasts. Each station was linked by telephone and teleprinter to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory in Stanmore. Information from the radar stations was combined with reports from the Observer Corps, thousands of civilian spotters with binoculars and telephones positioned throughout Britain. It was called the Dowding System, after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of RAF Fighter Command. Dowding was an austere, aloof figure. His pilots called him Stuffy. But he understood that the future of air defense wasn't about having more planes. It was about having better information. Fighter Command was being designed as an integrated air defense network, with radar as its eyes. But then, everything changed. September 1938, the Munich crisis. In September 1938, Britain stood on the brink of war with Germany over the Czechoslovakian Sudetenland. For 2 weeks, as Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany for negotiations, RAF Fighter Command prepared for immediate combat. The Chain Home system had exactly 5 operational stations. If war had come in September 1938, Britain would have been catastrophically vulnerable. The radar network was incomplete. The fighter force was undermanned and flying outdated aircraft. The command system was untested. Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement, buying what he called peace for our time. But Britain's military planners knew it was something else: borrowed time. the construction of Chain Home went into overdrive. By September 1939, when war finally came, Britain had 20 operational stations covering the approaches to London and the industrial Midlands. By July 1940, as the Battle of Britain began, there were 51 stations, creating an invisible barrier from Southampton to the Scottish border. The Germans knew the towers existed. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights had photographed them extensively. But German intelligence consistently misidentified them as radio broadcasting stations or experimental communications towers. Some German analysts suspected they might be related to aircraft detection, but the scale seemed absurd. Why would you need towers that large? German radar used much shorter wavelengths and much smaller antennas. The British system seemed primitive, inefficient, wasteful. They were right. It was all of those things, but it worked. The German blind spot Berlin, March 1939. General Wolfgang Martini, chief of signals for the Luftwaffe, received a troubling intelligence report. The document detailed British radar research, including technical specifications that seemed surprisingly accurate. Martini took the report to Hermann Göring. Göring's response was dismissive. Even if the British had some kind of radio detection system, it couldn't possibly be effective enough to matter. German bombers would fly in formations of hundreds. German fighters were superior. German tactics were superior. And most importantly, the German offensive would be so overwhelming, so fast, that no defensive system could respond in time. This was the core of German strategic thinking. We will hit you so hard, so fast, that it won't matter what you can see coming. It was blitzkrieg thinking applied to air warfare, and it had worked brilliantly in Poland and Norway and France and the Low Countries. The German military machine in 1939 and 1940 was the most effective fighting force on the planet. They had rewritten the textbook on modern warfare. But blitzkrieg works when you're choosing the time and place of battle. It works when you have the initiative, when the enemy is scrambling to respond to your moves. The Battle of Britain would be different. For the first time, Germany would be fighting on the enemy's terms, attacking a prepared defender, trying to establish air superiority over hostile territory, and the enemy could see them coming. The Knickerbein Affair. In the spring of 1940, as Germany overran Western Europe, British intelligence intercepted a curious message. A German bomber crew was being instructed to use their Knickerbein equipment for navigation during night raids. Knickerbein, crooked leg, was a radio navigation system the Luftwaffe had developed for blind bombing. The concept was elegant. Ground stations in occupied Europe would broadcast narrow radio beams. German bombers would fly along one beam until they intersected a second beam, crossing it at the target. When the bomber picked up both beams simultaneously, the bombardier would know he was over the target, even in total darkness or cloud cover. It was ingenious, and it was effective. British scientific intelligence, led by a brilliant physicist named Arviv Jones, analyzed the system and realized its potential. If the Germans could bomb accurately at night, the RAF's fighter defenses would be meaningless. But Jones and his team discovered something else. The Knickerbein beams could be jammed, bent, or spoofed using British transmitters. Throughout the summer of 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged, a secret electronic war was fought in parallel. British Meekening stations would detect German navigation beams and rebroadcast them from false locations, leading German bombers astray. Entire raids would miss their targets by miles, dropping bombs on empty fields because their instruments told them they were over London. The Germans, for their part, remained convinced their system was working perfectly. This is crucial to understanding the German failure. At every level, German commanders were receiving information that confirmed their assumptions. Their technology worked. Their tactics were sound. Their intelligence reports showed British defenses under strain. What they couldn't see was the invisible architecture that was turning Britain into a fortress. July 10th, 1940. Kanalkampf. The Battle of Britain officially began on July 10th, 1940, with German attacks on British shipping in the English Channel. The Luftwaffe's strategy was methodical. Phase 1. Establish air superiority over the Channel by destroying RAF aircraft that came to defend British convoys. Phase 2. Destroy fighter command on the ground by bombing airfields and aircraft factories. Phase 3. Achieve total air superiority, then launch Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. It was a sound plan designed by professional officers who had just conquered most of Europe. It failed completely. The first shock came within days. Luftwaffe bomber formations would cross the Channel, confident in their numbers and escort fighters, only to find RAF Hurricanes and Spitfires waiting for them at altitude. Again, and again, and again. German pilots began reporting what seemed like impossible response times. British fighters would be scrambled and climbing to intercept before the German formations even crossed the coast. It was as if the British somehow knew the exact time, altitude, and direction of every raid. They did. At RAF Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory, the operations room looked like nothing so much as a theater stage. In the center was a massive table map of southeastern England and the Channel. Women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAFS, stood around the map with long poles, moving markers representing German and British aircraft. Information flowed in constantly. Radar plots from chain home stations, visual reports from the Observer Corps, radio transmissions from pilots in the air. All of it was filtered, analyzed, and displayed on that central map in near real time. Above the map floor, in a glass-fronted gallery, sat the fighter controllers. These officers had a god's-eye view of the battle developing. They could see German formations building up over France. They could see which RAF squadrons were available, which were already engaged, which were refueling. And they could make decisions, which squadrons to scramble, where to position them, what altitude, what heading. The system wasn't perfect. There were delays, errors, miscommunications. Raids got through. But for the first time in history, a defender had something approaching perfect situational awareness. The Germans had numerical superiority, better training in some cases, and excellent aircraft. But they were fighting blind. August 13th, Adlertag, Eagle Day. On August 13th, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched Adlertag, Eagle Day, the opening of the main offensive against Fighter Command. The plan called for massive coordinated strikes against RAF airfields and radar stations. This time, German intelligence had correctly identified the chain home towers as part of the British air defense system. Several stations were to be destroyed in the opening hours. At 7 a.m., Luftwaffe bombers hit the radar station at Ventnor on the Isle of Wight. The towers were damaged, and the station went off the air. It was back online within 3 days, using temporary equipment. German bombers hit the station at Pevensey, minor damage. Back online within hours. Here's what the Germans didn't understand. The chain home stations were remarkably resilient. The towers themselves were hard to destroy. They were steel lattices that bombs would pass through without detonating. The real vulnerability was the operations buildings, but those were reinforced and could be quickly repaired. More importantly, the British had built redundancy into the system. If one station went down, neighboring stations would fill the gap. Mobile radar units could be deployed to cover blind spots. The Luftwaffe flew 1,485 sorties on Eagle Day. They lost 45 aircraft. The RAF lost 13 fighters in combat and lost several aircraft destroyed on the ground. Göring declared it a great victory, but the math was catastrophic for Germany. At this exchange rate, the Luftwaffe would run out of planes and trained crews long before the RAF did. Britain was producing more fighters than Germany. British pilots who bailed out over England could be back in combat within hours. German pilots who bailed out over England were prisoners of war. And still, somehow, British fighters kept appearing exactly where they needed to be. The hardest days, August 15th to August 18th. August 15th, the day Luftwaffe historians would later call Black Thursday. The Luftwaffe launched attacks from every available airfield in occupied Europe. Bombers from Norway hit targets in northern England. Bombers from France and Belgium hit the southeast. The goal was to overwhelm the British defenses with simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. For the first time, raids came in from outside the coverage of Chain Home. But the British had anticipated this. Chain Home low stations, supplementary radar using shorter wavelengths to detect low-altitude aircraft, had been deployed. The Observer Corps tracked raids once they crossed the coast. And critically, Fighter Command had been practicing exactly this kind of multi-axis defense. The Luftwaffe flew over 2,000 sorties. They lost 75 aircraft. The RAF lost 34 fighters in combat. Every single pilot who bailed out over Britain was recovered and returned to duty. The exchange rate was unsustainable for Germany. But the pressure on Fighter Command was immense. RAF pilots were flying 4, 5, sometimes 6 sorties per day. Exhaustion was becoming a critical problem. Several squadrons were down to half strength. If the Luftwaffe could maintain this tempo for a few more weeks, Fighter Command would break. Göring changed strategy. On August 24th, in response to an RAF bombing raid on Berlin, itself a reprisal for a Luftwaffe raid that accidentally hit London, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to begin attacks on London itself. It was a catastrophic strategic error. September 7th. The London Blitz begins. On September 7th, 1940, the Luftwaffe shifted its focus from airfields to cities. Massive formations of bombers escorted by hundreds of fighters struck London in daylight raids. The docks burned. Residential areas were devastated. Over 400 civilians were killed on the first day. It was exactly what the British had feared most. But it gave Fighter Command the breathing room it desperately needed. While the Luftwaffe was bombing London, RAF ground crews were repairing damaged airfields. Replacement aircraft were flowing in from factories. Exhausted pilots were being rotated out for rest. And still, the radar system kept working. On September 15th, later commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched what was supposed to be the decisive blow. 2 massive raids on London, timing to overwhelm the British defenses through sheer numbers. At Fighter Command headquarters, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park watched the map as the first raid developed over France. He could see it building. 100+ aircraft, maybe 150. They were forming up methodically, taking their time. Park scrambled 11 squadrons. By the time the German formation crossed the coast, RAF fighters were already at altitude, positioned to intercept. The Germans ran into a wall of Spitfires and Hurricanes over Kent. The second raid came in hours later. Same result. Park scrambled 11 more squadrons. practically every available fighter in southeast England. To the Germans, it must have seemed impossible. How could the British have so many fighters ready? Where were they coming from? No matter how many RAF planes they shot down, more kept appearing. German bomber crews began calling England the land of the lost squadrons. They reported destroying British fighters by the dozen, and yet the next day there would be more. At one point during the fighting on September 15th, Winston Churchill visited Fighter Command headquarters. He stood in the gallery overlooking the map, watching the battle develop. Churchill turned to Park and asked, "What other reserves have we?" Park replied, "There are none." Every available squadron was in the air. If the Germans had launched a third raid that afternoon, there would have been nothing to stop it. But they didn't. Because from the German perspective, they were already facing overwhelming opposition. Their intelligence estimates said Fighter Command was down to its last few squadrons, but the fighters kept coming. The radar system made the RAF look far stronger than it actually was. German commanders looking at their casualty reports concluded they were facing an enemy with nearly unlimited reserves. The Luftwaffe lost 56 aircraft on September 15th. The RAF lost 28 fighters, with all but one pilot recovered. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The realization. German commanders spent months trying to understand what went wrong. Intelligence reports from occupied France described the massive radar towers along the British coast. Luftwaffe analysts had photographs, measurements, even some technical details captured from RAF equipment. But the reports kept coming back with the same conclusion. The British radar system was primitive, inefficient, and limited. German radar was more advanced technologically. The Freya and Würzburg systems being deployed in Germany were superior in almost every measurable way. What they couldn't see was the system behind the technology. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the Battle of Britain. The British didn't win because their technology was better. They won because they had built an integrated system where technology, doctrine, training, and command structure all worked together. The Germans had excellent radar. They had excellent aircraft. They had skilled pilots and experienced commanders. But they had never conceived of using radar the way the British did, as the foundation of an entire defensive architecture. German radar was deployed piecemeally, station by station, often under the control of local commanders, with no central coordination. Information from radar stations rarely made it to Fighter Command in time to be useful. There was no equivalent to the Fighter Command operations room, no single place where all available information came together. By late 1940, German military intelligence had pieced together a fairly accurate picture of how Chain Home worked. But by then, the moment had passed. The Battle of Britain was over. Germany would never attempt a daylight strategic bombing campaign against Britain again. The planned invasion was abandoned, and the technological race had entered a new phase. The electronic war escalates. If the Germans were slow to appreciate radar for air defense, they quickly understood its value once they were on the defensive themselves. By 1941, as RAF Bomber Command began its strategic bombing campaign against Germany, German air defenses were the most sophisticated in the world. The Kammhuber Line, a belt of radar stations and night fighter zones stretching from Denmark to France, became a deadly gauntlet for British bombers. German scientists developed increasingly advanced radar systems. The Würzburg radar could detect aircraft at 40 miles with far greater accuracy than Chain Home. The Liechtenstein airborne radar gave German night fighters the ability to hunt British bombers in total darkness. But the British had learned the lesson: integrate everything. RAF bombers began carrying window strips of aluminum foil that reflected radar signals, creating thousands of false targets. British scientists developed Serrate, a receiver that could detect German radar emissions and guide RAF night fighters to German fighters. Electronic countermeasures became a constant game of move and countermove. The war became a technological arms race, where both sides were racing to outthink, out-innovate, and out-engineer the other. But Germany was always reacting, always playing catch-up. They had started the war with a technological lead and squandered it through strategic blindness. Captured documents. The paper trail of hubris. After the war, Allied intelligence teams swept through Germany, gathering documents and interrogating scientists and military officials. What they found was damning. Minutes from high-level Luftwaffe meetings in 1937 and 1938 showed that German commanders had been briefed on British radar development. They knew, but they had concluded it was not a priority. One captured document, a memo from the Luftwaffe Technical Office, dated March 1939, contained a chilling sentence. The British radio detection system, while technically functional, does not represent a significant tactical advantage given the planned employment of massed formations and the superiority of German aircraft. They had assessed the technology correctly, but they had completely misunderstood how it would be used. Another document from after the Battle of Britain contained Adolf Galland's analysis of the RAF's defensive system. Galland, one of Germany's top fighter aces and eventually commander of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, wrote, "We were not fighting pilots. We were fighting a system, and we had no equivalent." This was the moment of realization. Technology alone doesn't win wars. Systems win wars. The human cost. The Battle of Britain was decided by slim margins. If the Luftwaffe had maintained pressure on RAF airfields for another week, fighter command might have broken. If the radar network had been knocked out for even a few days, the balance might have tipped. The casualties tell the story. The Luftwaffe lost 1,887 aircraft from July to October 1940. The RAF lost 1,023 fighters in combat. But the RAF could replace losses. Germany couldn't. More importantly, 544 RAF aircrew were killed in the Battle of Britain. Every one of them was defending their home. Many of the survivors went on to fly hundreds more missions. The Luftwaffe lost over 2,600 aircrew killed or captured. These were trained bomber pilots, navigators, gunners, men with years of experience. Losses that could never be fully replaced. Churchill famously said of the RAF pilots, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." But perhaps equal credit should go to the scientists and engineers who built the invisible shield that kept those few from being overwhelmed. The arrogance of certainty. In 1935, Germany led the world in science and technology. German radar was as advanced as Britain's. German scientists understood the principles of radio detection just as well as their British counterparts. They lost the radar race not because of technological failure, but because of conceptual failure. They couldn't imagine needing to defend. Hermann Göring, architect of the Luftwaffe, embodied this blindness. He built an air force designed exclusively for offensive operations. When defensive fighting came, the Luftwaffe had no doctrine, no training, no integrated system to fall back on. The British facing possible extinction, built exactly what they needed. Not the most advanced technology, not the most elegant solution, but a system that worked. Watt's chain home radar was clunky, primitive by German standards. But it was deployed when and where it mattered. It was integrated into a command system that could use the information it provided, and it was operated by people who understood that the system was more important than any individual component. This is the lesson. Superiority comes from integration, not just innovation. The legacy. The Battle of Britain proved that radar could change the course of history. After 1940, no military force would ever again ignore the importance of electronic sensing and command systems. World War II became, in many ways, an electronic war. Radar evolved from a defensive tool to an offensive one. Ground scanning radar guided bombers to their targets. Shipborne radar gave the Allies a decisive advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic. Radar proximity fuses revolutionized anti-aircraft fire. By 1945, radar technology had advanced beyond anything imagined in 1940. But the fundamental principle that information is as important as firepower had been proven over the skies of Britain. Today, every military force on Earth relies on integrated sensor networks. Satellites, drones, electronic warfare systems, the descendants of chain home, are now so ubiquitous we barely notice them. But in 1940 it was new, it was secret, and it was decisive. The final irony. After the war, several high-ranking German officers were asked what surprised them most about their defeat. Many mentioned technology, radar in particular, but one answer stands out. General Günther Korten, who served as chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, said something that cuts to the heart of the matter. We assumed our enemies were as arrogant as we were. They were not. They were desperate. And desperation breeds innovation in ways that confidence never can. Hitler's scientists mocked the radar. They shouldn't have. Because while they were debating theory and calculating optimal wavelengths and dismissing practical applications as beneath German ingenuity, the British were building the system that would save their nation. And by the time the Germans realized what they were facing, the Spitfires were already in the air.